So I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Una Kravets to the stage.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. How are you doing? All right. I'm here in New York. I'm so excited to be here. And I'm here to talk to you about CSS image effects, which there are a lot of, and I'll show you some examples. So like you said, my name is Una. It's pronounced like unicorn. There's a little mnemonic to remind you how. I currently work at DigitalOcean. Started on Monday. It's here based in New York. So I've been hanging out. Love the city. I started a couple of SaaS meetups. So I started one in DC. I started one in Austin, where I'm currently located. And I have this podcast. It's kind of OK. I think it's pretty cool. So check it out if you're into tech tools. This is really what I like to describe my job as, breaking the web with CSS. And I'm doing that right now in this presentation. So I'll kind of go over what you can do, what you can't do, and what you probably shouldn't do. But it's all right. You can do cool things with CSS. Just keep in mind performance and accessibility. So my real qualifications for this talk are, if you check out DeviantArt. Anybody remember DeviantArt back in the day? Who here had a DeviantArt account? Yeah. Lots of image editing, working with curves, working with color manipulation, oversaturating tulips. I called this piece emo tulips. That's why I blocked out my name so that none of you could find me later. But it's just been a lot of experimentation through using these programs. So I'm going to go over the 3 tenets of web image effects. And those are filters, blend modes, and gradients. And I'm going to show you 6 different CSS image effects that combine these 3 different tenets. So filters. Filters and blend modes online using CSS and SVG are like a lens on top of your image. When you're using something like Canvas, you're actually changing the pixel values themselves. But with filters, you're just applying an effect on top of your current image. So it's better for performance when you're applying these filters rather than changing the pixels on the page load. So if you look at something like sepia, sepia is an effect that sort of creates this vintage, like grayed out, yellowy look to photographs. It looks like this. With CSS filters, you can apply that in one line of code. And if you're using something like auto prefixer, you can just write filter sepia1, and it applies the full sepia effect. It's a shortcut. So you can do this in SVG as well. And it looks like this. This is using a color matrix. And it just takes a lot of understanding of what this is doing. It's a table of values for R, G, B, and A channels, and M is the multiplier. That's why it's 5x4 grid. But with CSS, you just have one line of code, which is why I like to say that CSS filters are the carefree younger cousin of the SVG filter. There are going to be a lot of GIFs that make no sense in this presentation, so get ready for it. And that's why I want to focus on the CSS filter effects rather than going into the math of SVG. This is the current ability to use these. And the support's pretty good for Firefox and Chrome. It's going to get there with Edge. I know that they're currently working on it. But if you have to support IE, just remember that you're not going to be able to see the filter effects. Not the worst thing in the world, because if you think about progressive enhancement, you just won't see the filter effect. You'll see the image as you would expect to. It just won't have an effect applied to it. So the CSS filter effects that we currently have available are blur, brightness, contrast, drop shadow, grayscale, hue rotate, invert, opacity, sepia, saturate. And these take a few different options. You can use like pixels, ems, any sort of like numeric value for blur as an example. With brightness, you can do anything below 1 will make it darker, anything above 1 will make it brighter. And just really play around with these in DevTools is how I encourage you to explore them. And they're pretty self-explanatory. One line of code, just go in there and play. You can do a lot of really powerful things with one line of code, and this is an example of that. All these images are just examples from a blog post that I wrote. As you can see, I have a white background. But I drew these images using the Paper app, which inherently has this gray background to it. Instead of opening them all individually in Photoshop, editing them each individually, exporting them each, and then applying them back to the page, I used one line of code to apply a CSS filter and just unified all the images in the page. And so it's something that you can do if you know this is available, quick and easy, get it done. But blend modes are really the bulk of what I want to explain to you here, because there's so many and they're so powerful, especially when you combine them with layering and different variable options and then eventually gradients. So with blend modes, we have more capabilities with CSS. There's darken, multiply, and color burn, which is the darken color group. lighten, screen, color dodge, overlay, soft light, hard light, and difference, exclusion, hue, saturation, color, luminosity. I'm going to go back over these again, so don't have to worry about remembering what all of them are individually. But they're also very powerful. And as you can see, in Chrome DevTools, you can just open up this eyeline panel, inspect any image, and see what all the different image effects you have available to you with one line of code are. This is actually new in Chrome DevTools since last update. They didn't have all the shorthand mixed blend modes on the side, but now you can just twirl through them with your arrow keys and see what all the options are available to you. So it really allows for a very different look with every single different blend mode. There's two different ways to implement these. There's background blend mode and there's mixed blend mode. And the support is pretty similar. But with background blend mode, the difference is you're applying the blend mode to each element that is a background in one item. So if you have multiple backgrounds, the background blend mode will apply to that list of backgrounds. With mixed blend mode, you're applying the entire blend mode to the element itself so that it mixes with the page. So if you resize that page, if you move it around, as you do that, it'll interact with the elements around it on that web page. So two different options for using these things. You get a similar effect. And the way that they interact with the pixels is the same. So Darken Blend modes, I'm going to use Bob Ross here and some happy little trees to demonstrate this blend mode. I just want to surround Bob Ross and happy little trees. And then apply the blend mode. So as you can see here, what it's doing is it's taking the luminosity value, so the brightness value of those pixels, and it's multiplying them. This is anything from the grayscale of dark to light. I'm going to show you how around the trees, if I apply this and remove it, that white value has completely disappeared, and the black value that surrounded the trees remained. This is super useful, really popular blend mode. Another example of using this is here. So I have a beta fish. I could apply a video on this. You can apply these to GIFs. You can apply them to any media type. And then if I wanted to multiply it, I'm creating a dynamic GIF on the page right there. I can also add some filters. So remember how I mentioned blur was an option. I added some brightness here, decreased the saturation a bit. So all I'm doing is in my browser, it's all animatable with CSS filters. I'm creating a GIF on the page. And if you're using video, like an MP4 instead of a GIF, you're going to be saving a lot of memory on your page, and you're going to be saving some request loads since that item is going to be smaller. And since this is also two different elements, you can interact with it. You can hover over it. You can apply the blur on a hover and really create these dynamic elements on your page. So here you can see they used a black and white image in the background of this page, and they brought in that yellow element and multiplied it on top for a pop of color without, affecting the size of the image. Since they're using black and white JPEGs, it's creating a smaller size for their that they're sending out on the server. But they're still having that really nice aesthetic yellow look on the page. And here's just another example how it just brings a little bit of unity to your items. You can use variables with this. You can cascade these effects, since it is CSS, and apply them to multiple items. So the next blend mode in this group is color burn. And color burn works a little differently. So as you can see, the values are much more saturated here. And the algorithm that we're using uses some inversions. So the way that you invert a pixel's luminosity value is to subtract it from 1. And that's why you see this 1 minus b, that's the background layer, so that's Bob Ross. So we're taking the inverse of the background layer's luminosity divided by the active layer's luminosity. There's a little bit of math here. And then the last one is the Darken Blend mode. And what we're getting here is a new value. The way this works is different because it's using the RGB values instead of that alpha, instead of the luminosity value. You can start with this color. So I have this pink color here as an example. And if I darken that by this blue color, we get this purpley color in the middle here. And the reason why is because you're looking at every single one of those RGB channels and determining which is darker. RGB 000 is black. So if we compare these values, what's darker, 195 or 50? So 50. And then we're going to bring that into our new color. Between 25 and 100, it's 25. Between 100 and 125, it's 125. So this is what's creating the new values of the color that we're generating. And that's what the Darken Blend mode is doing for you. Same thing with Photoshop. So if you're using that as a program or Illustrator, this is how it's working. So with Light and Blend modes, I'm going to use Pokemon here and Digimon to compare. and just throw those on top. So the screen blend mode is the exact opposite of multiply. You're taking the inverse of the pixel values and multiplying it by the inverse of the pixel values, the luminosity of each of those layers, and then you're inverting that again. So that's why you see all of these 1 minuses. Color dodge is similar to color burn in the fact that it's, I'll get back to that in a second, in the fact that it's really creating this bolder effect. You see that bright yellow, that blowout, because the algorithm there is using that inversion again. And then lighten is creating a new value. So another example of using this is here, I'm using this picture, this portrait. If I wanted to apply a dynamic texture, I could just throw that on top. And then if you screen it, it's going to get rid of all that black. And on the page, you can create these visual effects. So you can start to create applications on the browser that you wouldn't be able to think about doing before, that you would have to open Photoshop to do. And again, think about when you hover over this, you could blur out that texture. You could see the image behind it more vividly. There's a lot of creativity that can happen here that's yet to be explored on the web. So here's that example again. If we are lightening this pink by a blue, we're getting this new tone of this magenta. We're looking at every single value and now determining which is the higher value, which is lighter value. And it's creating these new tones for us by using that lighten technique. So this brings us to our first of 6 CSS image effects that I want to show you. And this is the vintage washout effect, which uses lighten. On the left, we see this image without the effect applied. And on the right, we'll look at this overwash, this purpley gray hue really applied to this image. It knocks out a lot of the detail in the shadow. And it's something that we see really popular these days with Instagram with different filter effects. It just creates more of like a vintage effect to our images and to things that we see online. But this is really easy to do if you think about how to use the blend modes and how you think about lighten. So what we'll do is we'll use that blend mode of lighten, but then we'll take the background color, so we'll be applying the lighten color to the darkest color that we want to apply, the shadow color. So instead of applying a light color, we want to apply the darkest color. And this sets a threshold. So here I'm using the background blend mode of lighten since I'm using multiple backgrounds in this example. And I have an image of this city, Dubrovnik. And then I have this Hex Code, which is the second background color on that image. And if I bring it up to the top of yellow, it washes it out. So a nice medium would be like a nice dark brown, maybe a gray color, maybe a navy color. This can all be done dynamically in DevTools, so you can explore in your browser. You can see it online. Here's another example of seeing this image effect. Spotify did a really cool end-of-year campaign where they used this sort of aesthetic to unify things, bring it together, and just limit their color choices as well. The next is the contrast blend modes. And here there are so many sports teams in New York, so I'm using the Mets and the Yankees. I'm going to contrast those and overlay them. Contrast blend modes are really interesting because they're the only group that uses the combination of the other groups. So with overlay, we're using the screen blend mode and the multiply blend mode, screen on the lighter values and multiply on the darker values, both at half strength. And this is taking the luminosity of the background layers pixels. Soft light looks extremely similar to overlay, but it's taking the active layers pixel values. So they're doing a similar thing. Hard light uses a different blend mode, so this looks completely different. This is using color dodge and color burn, but doing the same thing. You're using color dodge at the lighter pixel values, color burn with the darker pixels, and you're doing both of those at half strength. So comparative blend modes, I'm going to use Tim here. Tim here is a man with big dreams. He's one of the speakers coming up. I'm going to compare him to a potato, a little potato there, and see what it does. So I'm throwing that on top. So what the difference blend mode does is it's really used for lining up transparencies. It's used for different items within the same image. What it does is it takes the same pixels they're similar, it turns them black, and anything different, you'll see what the difference is between them. With exclusion, does a very similar thing, except those pixel values turn gray. So if I remove this potato from Tim, since the backgrounds are similar, if I'm using the difference blend mode, that turns black. Where it's more different in the middle, like the hair might be a little different of a color, although it is pretty similar around here, it turns black. That's where the values are more different from the two images that you're comparing. Does anybody remember these spot the differences games? Does anyone see some of the differences? Feel free to shout them out. Ketchup, that's one, yeah. Yep, the star on the hat. So you can use difference to cheat at these games. If I hover over them, you can instantly see what those differences are. Like this is what it was intended for making sure that your transparencies are lined up. So basically, cheat at your games with difference blend mode. And then composite blend mode is the last one that I'll be talking about. And I'll be using kittens and this rainbow so you could see what the colors are doing here. So to understand these, I'm going to keep this up. This is sort of an explanation of colors on the web. Hue is sort of like the value of that color. The saturation is how much it is infused with the luminosity value, so how bright that color is, essentially. That's not the right word. And luminosity is like the black and white values of it. So what the hue mixed blend mode does is it takes the hue of the active layer. The rainbow here is going to be the active layer. And it's then mixing that on top of the luminosity and saturation of the layer behind it. So if you look at these cats, it's still very pastel around the skin. You're not getting that bright saturated value of the rainbow. You're just taking the hue, so that value around the wheel. With saturation, it turns crazy. Like the cat's eyes are bright blue, but you're not grabbing the color. You're not grabbing the hue of the rainbow above the cats. You're just using the saturation. So the normal tones from the cats just become really, really saturated around the eyes. You can see it around the fur. Luminosity kind of looks crazy. Here, we're taking just that luminosity value of the rainbow. You see like the cat's eye is like poking out. The luminosity of the rainbow is really bright around that yellow and around that cyan, like the teal color. And we're applying that to both the saturation and the hue of the cats. Color mixes to these blend modes. So we're just rainbowizing these cats here. It's taking both the saturation and luminosity of the active layer, so of that rainbow, and applying it to the luminosity of the cats. In this case, that cat picture could be black and white, and you're colorizing it. That's exactly what you're doing here. It doesn't matter what colors are on the cats. You're just taking the black and white values. So if we think about what the mixed blend mode of color is doing, it brings me to our next image effect, which is the infrared effect, which is a cool one. So infrared photography kind of brings this really surreal aesthetic to your photos. I love seeing it on the web. This is done with a manual camera, but we can fake it with CSS because we can do anything with CSS. So the infrared effect takes a couple of steps. First, you want to duplicate that image. Then you want to apply the filter of invert to your image, back to those CSS filters from the beginning. Use the blend mode of color, and then play with the hues. So the reason that we want to do that is we want to first invert the filter to take some interesting color values out of our image, and then we get the thing on the right, which is sort of close, but not quite, because we don't want our shadows to be light. We want our shadows to be dark. We still want to keep the luminosity values of that background layer. So then we want to use a blend mode of color. So you can use mixed blend mode. You could use background blend mode, depending on how you have your images and layout set up. And when you apply that blend mode of color, it takes the color value of that inverted item and it puts it on top of the luminosity value, so retaining the shadows and highlights of the picture behind it. So we get a much more understandable image. It's starting to look a lot closer to what we want to get. And the last step is just to play with CSS filter values. So here I'm using Q rotate. I wrote like a little Sass mix in that just with one line of code, like you can pull in like the hue rotate value that you want, and it creates these infrared effects. If you want to get more detailed, you can use that FE color matrix that I showed really briefly earlier with the sepia effect. Then you can have a lot more control over every single RGBA channel, so you can create customized effects that match your brand guides, that match your style, that match the color of your site, and just do it all with CSS filters and blend modes. Gradients are that last tenet, and this is really where a lot of power comes in, because CSS gradients allow us to apply multiple colors to a single plane, and then mix that plane onto another image behind it. So basic gradients just go from top to bottom. I'm using this like pink and purpley color. You can change the direction of the gradient, so you can go to right, you can go like to left, anything. You can change the degree of the gradients. So you can also open dev tools and just like twirl this up and down, and it'll go in a circle with your arrow keys. It's a lot of fun to play with. You can create different stops, so you can really determine where these things start and stop. A little fun fact is if you have your one value starting at 0, stopping at 10%, the second value starting at 10%, and then continuing, you can create stripes with gradients. You can have repeating gradients. So here's a repeating linear gradient that's sort of going from this pink to blue. And that last value is determining the size of the entire gradient. So if I, for example, make this like 4ems, there's a much more distant spot between them, and 3ems, as you can see. So you can have a lot of fun with those. Radial gradients will take the shape of their parent container, but you can also change that. So you can change what the shape is, you can change what the size is, so I could make this 100, and really just start playing around with those. So once you understand how CSS gradients work, you can make a lot more accurate photographic effects. And one of those is vignettes. Typically, you would think of vignette, I gotta throw this thing up really quickly, what can I do? Inset box shadow is something that comes instantly to mind. So this is what an inset box shadow looks like. It starts from the top corner. You can set the size of it. You can set the depth of that box shadow. And then you could center it. So here's an option for a vignette. It's okay looking. It's taking this weird rectangular shape, so it's not really what we want to get. We can do better than this. Let's talk about radial gradients. That's the next thing that we mentioned. You can start with the radial gradients. This is sort of dark here, so maybe we want to expand it, have that radial gradient start at 50% instead of 0% on the page. Starting to look a little bit better, but it's still sort of rectangular. It's not really exactly what we're looking for. I think that we can still do better than this. What we really ideally want to do is think about when you take an image and you apply a vignette, the lens of that vignette, no matter if the image is square or rectangle, is going to look like this. It kind of goes around the whole image. So we just want the dark values to be around the corners. We don't want that strange oval inside the image itself. Like, this is much more natural looking. So we can use the shapes that we just learned about, making the radial gradient a circle, making that circle start at 50%, making it end at 150%. So it can end outside of the V-box area. And this looks a lot more natural. So it looks like this. Once we start playing around with this, we can then play around with color and blend mode. Here's that same gradient, but turned red and used with a sort of a difference blend mode. Once you've done that, you can start playing with lomography. Like, the possibilities are endless. It just builds and builds and builds on all these skills. The next effect is the bokeh effect. And this one's really cool. It definitely highlights the power of using CSS gradients. So bokeh photography sort of looks like this. Here's an example of a portrait. It really plays on light and sort of is characterized by these circular large dots inside of images that are a play on light and focus. And we can make those with gradients, as we just saw. So this it goes outside the page, it goes outside the view box, but we can control that. We can control the start and stop points. We can make it a circle. We can blur those edges so that it looks a lot more natural and faded into that image. We can write a whole list of them. Here's a ridiculous number of gradients that you would never want to write by hand, but as you can see, like, you could start to make these bokeh effects. And this, I would not write by hand, but you can generate it with the magical random property in Sass. This is like my favorite thing. So random allows you to get a random number from 0 exclusive to 1. So as an example here, what I did was just created 2 functions. I have a random bokeh function where I'm setting the size and the spread, and here I'm just using sort of a default value. And then every single RGB color, I'm setting an RGBA from random. So since I wanted the colors to be a little bit consistent, I created a constant on the R value of 220. So for the G and the B value, I'm adding 80 and 200. Since I didn't want this to be like super rainbow pastel, I wanted some consistency with that photographic effect. And then for the alpha, I'm just having it completely random. So what I'm returning here is a single radial gradient. I'm getting a random size times that size value that I set, and I'm setting the colors of that gradient. I'm returning a single bokeh dot. So this next function is going to build all of those dots that we saw in that previous slide. I'm just calling this function give me bokehs, and I'm creating a background list. And then for every single bokeh dot that I'm appending, I'm saying how many I want. I'm saying the size and the spread of those things. I'm creating a background list, and I'm returning that background list. So this is just a bunch of gradients that are in a background. Please don't do this in a production site. I'm just showing you that it's possible. But it's just going to generate it. Another thing to note is that Sass random is random for a single process of your CSS. When you're serving your CSS, it's not going to be random on the site. It's going to be the same thing every time. But with CodePen, it's a great tool for using this, because every time you rerun it, you can get a different sort of pattern for your bokeh dots. And that's really fun to use. So once you find that pattern that you really like, you can save that and then put that in your production code. Don't do this in your production code, but if you're using the random function for anything, that's a good way to use it. Here's another little example of a CodePen. All of this is randomly generated, all the gradients in here. So everyone who opens the CodePen will get a unique view of this, which I think is pretty cool and artistic. Allison House created a graphic that looked like this, and then I just generated this in code and liked the idea of having randomness, because I'm very indecisive. So if you use random, you don't have to decide on anything. But all the animations here have a delay that's random. All the gradient colors change. It's really fun to play with and to experiment with on the web. And this brings us to combining all those things: filters, blend modes, gradients. Bring them all together. The fifth CSS image effect that I'm going to talk about is advanced filter effects. If you have an idea in mind, you can make anything happen. Does anybody remember the days of like those blurry backgrounds? You'd go on like DeviantArt and like look up blurry backgrounds and put them on your site in the header. It was like a very popular, just neutral background. So you don't need to use somebody else's. You don't have to pay for these. You can make them yourself in CSS using gradients. If you break them down, it's just a series of color. It's a series here. So let's recreate that. So what we can do is, instead of making this red background, we can do a linear gradient. And this is going from pink to blue. So we want to make the direction go to the right. This is more like a deep pink. You can get the color right if you want. That looks fine. And then we can layer these things, because we can layer gradients. It's an endless list here. So we can also add a radial gradient on top of that. And this is going to go from wheat to transparent. Transparent's a keyword that you can use. We can make this go at the top. We can have this be like a circle at the top. We can add like that tomato color. So add another linear gradient from tomato to transparent. Have this be like 145 degrees. Anyway, you can see that I'm slowly building this all together. I can pull this off the screen. If I want to take the time and go through it, this is what it looks like. Just sort of practicing and playing around with that. It gives you a lot of flexibility to create effects that you want if you have a specific idea in mind. And it really unifies the page. Since it is CSS, it cascades. An example of applying a very similar gradient to that on this image is here. So if I take it off, you see that the images sort of fade into the background. When I apply it, without having to open all these images in Photoshop, edit them all individually, apply the filters, the blend modes, export the images, you can just do it in code in your browser in the medium with which you're presenting. Again, if you're using these blend modes, make sure the image, the photograph, is on top of the color that you're applying to it for accessibility purposes. Because if you're in an older browser and that color is laying on top of that image, you won't be able to see the image if it's not the first background that you're applying. Instagram is a great tool that we use these days, and that was a great source of inspiration for me when I thought about, OK, which filters are there out there to sort of recreate? You can basically recreate any filter that you want. So here's an example of 1977, early bird. And these are only using one pseudo element. This is just applying filters and one pseudo element with a mixed blend mode on the image. Here's lo-fi. There's moon, toaster, lots of options. So there's an open source project called CSSGram that I built, and it shows a variety of filters. You can go in and play with the code. You can use this, apply it to images that you want. I know people have used this on video before. They've used it in apps for like coffee shops that have like inherent Instagram-like qualities on them, which is pretty cool. And you can contribute. So there's a test sheet if you want to try to contribute to open source in a visual way. This is a great visual way to do that. There's a test sheet of what's been done, what's still yet to be done. So it's that same URL, but /test, and it's all in the GitHub repo. I encourage you to go ahead and contribute and play around with the filters this way. And this brings me to my last image effect. If you have 3D glasses in your bag, which you all should have got, they're pretty awesome, branded 3D glasses. You can go ahead and put those on now. Anaglyphs basically look like this. They are created with a camera that takes 2 images about 2.5 centimeters away from your eye, which is like the pupillary distance on average, and applies these 2 colors, this blue and red color, to make an image appear 3D. 3-dimensional, like it's coming out at you. This is like an old school sort of thing. And while we can't do this with 2 different images, since we don't have a camera, unless you did have that camera, we can recreate it and fake this in CSS if we bring together everything that we learned about those blend modes. So if we keep in mind, we're going to be using the lighten and the darken blend modes. And this is just a little refresher on what those things are doing. We're going to start with this color. So let's say we start with cyan, because that is one of the colors that you use to create this anaglyph effect. So that color is 0255255. We're going to darken it with red. And if you look at those RGB values, it's 25500. It becomes black, which is good. That's what we want. That's what we're going to start to work with. It's taking that darkest value, so 000, and literally getting that. Here's an example that I found when I Googled dogs with a Z. It's apparently a game online. Like I said, random slides. So we're going to take that little combination that we made and place it on top of this game dogs. Here we have that lighten and darken item. And we are going to screen this layer on top of this dogs game. So we're getting a little window into this dog's face. Do you see where I'm going yet? OK, maybe not yet, but we'll get there in a second. So then you can apply these as background blend modes on the same image. So if we take this image of the skateboarder, apply a background blend mode of darken on one and a background blend mode of lighten on the other with that cyan, we can get something like this. Ooh. If you put these on now, like your eyes are probably going to hurt because it's continuously moving. But we are recreating with CSS these anaglyphs by thinking about how these things all interact with each other. We're screening the dark color, and that's why it's just becoming the pixel value that's original. We're seeing right through it. And we're getting that shadow value with the red and blue. So once we've done that, we can then apply perspective, and we can apply a few CSS transforms to sort of start to recreate what that would look like with our eyes and how that change appears on the image. And we get things like this. So with a regular plain photo, you can apply all these different image effects and sort of fake this anaglyph look on the web. And you can take that even further with animations. Here's just like one little example of a Rubik's Cube. There's so much to be explored here. I'm really excited for people to explore it. So in conclusion, here's Moore's Law. Moore's Law is the observation that over the history of computing hardware, the number of transistors in a dense integrated circuit has approximately doubled every 2 years. OK, what does that mean? It means there's exponential growth in our computing capabilities. And because of that growth, the Internet of Things has also exploded. So here we see these devices on our fridges, I use a Wemo. I walk into my apartment and I tell my Amazon Echo to turn on my lights. It's so lazy. I love it. But it's everywhere. Like the Internet of Things is everywhere. And the browsers are everywhere. Browsers are all over it. They're in our cars, in Teslas, in our fridges, like iPads. They're everywhere. You can even browse the web on those Paperlike devices. So I did this really scientific study that had 0 sample size, in which I determined, that means graphic processing power on the web is also going up, right? Browsers are getting better. They really are. And soon we'll be able to implement those image effects even more and put them in production. So even though right now it's not fully supported, I encourage you to art the web, to play around with things, to see what you can do to push the browser. The only way that we're going to make the browsers better, and the only way that we're going to make them faster and more performant is if we push them in this way. Some of those demos are on arttheweb.com. If you want some more detail on them, I encourage you to check out that site. And thank you.